Joshua is the Old Testament's book of triumph and victory. It tells the story of the Israelites' conquest of Canaan under Joshua, the nation's spiritual and military leader. But the story told in this powerful Old Testament book began hundreds of years before the events it records. Really, we have to go all the way back to Abram, a man God spoke to and made some wonderful promises to. Promises that were passed on to his son Isaac and grandson Jacob. God promised that he would have a special relationship with their descendants and that those descendants would be given the fertile land of Canaan. Jacob and his family moved to Egypt in a time of terrible famine. The little family stayed there for 400 years, but boy did that little family grow. The 70 who entered Egypt multiplied to become well over 1 million persons in total. But unfortunately, that was just about the only positive they had going for them, because during their stay in Egypt, they had become slaves to the Egyptians. God had not forgotten his promises though, so he raised up Moses to lead the Israelites out through a series of miracles to freedom. But the generation of Israelites that left Egypt in the Exodus couldn't seem to figure out how to fully put their trust in God, and so they rebelled. And their rebellion cost them dearly, because that entire generation, except for 2 faithful old men, wandered aimlessly through the desert until one by one, over the course of 40 years, their entire generation died out. The generation that followed, however, learned from their parents' mistakes. This new generation did trust God and was fully committed to obey him. It's this new and committed generation that we read about in the book of Joshua. It's this new obedient generation who wins by warfare the land God promised to Abraham so long ago. The book of Joshua has long been a favorite of believers. We love its stories of Rahab, who chose to side with God against her own city and whose faith saved her life. Of Jericho and the puzzling command to march silently around the fortress city, just waiting for God to tumble its massive walls. But most of all, Joshua reminds us of the faithfulness of God, who keeps all his promises. And Joshua reminds us of the need for obedience if we are to claim God's promises to us and experience spiritual victory in these last days. Towards the end of the book of Joshua, as he's giving his farewell speech, because he knew he was soon going to die, he gives an earnest warning to the people of Israel and reminds them of the dangers of abandoning God as their parents did. He outlines clearly for them that following the false gods of the surrounding nations will bring certain destruction, and he implores them to be faithful to God. But ultimately, he says to them, you have to be the ones to choose. In Joshua 24, verse 15, he says, and if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Allow me to take this opportunity to extend special greetings to all of you listening by radio or viewing by live stream this Sabbath morning. We have a wonderful team of pastors, workers, and administrators here in the Cayman Islands Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, and it's my privilege today to bring you greetings on their behalf. This is now the 3rd Sabbath that we've had to broadcast our services via radio and internet because the threat of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, has really disrupted our lives. Our churches are closed. As a matter of fact, our entire country has gone into lockdown mode, which means now that, at least at the time of this recording, there's basically no one on our roads. Our always vibrant tourism industry has shut down. Our beaches are empty. Even the supermarkets that only a few days ago had lines out the doors appear to be all but abandoned. And that's because we're all in our homes in a collective effort, albeit mandated by government, to save lives and to stop this virus from spreading rampantly throughout our country, the way that it's currently wreaking havoc in others. All over the internet, and particularly social media, we've seen the message, stay home, save lives. It's the one time in history you get to play the role of the hero in the story, ironically, by sitting on your couch. And so we've been instructed to stay home to save lives. And I have to admit, the concept has intrigued me enough that I've decided to use it as the title for today's sermon. Stay home, save lives. It's really a simple concept, but I believe its simplicity veils a deeper profundity that deserves to be explored. A 10-year-old boy decided he wanted to take up judo, which, as you may already know, is a combat sport. The only problem was that he couldn't use his left arm because he didn't have one. In any case, he signed up to train with a seasoned judo master. But after about 3 months of training, the boy was discouraged because his sensei had only taught him one move. With some confusion, the boy asked, "Shouldn't I know more than one move by now?" The sensei answered, "You are correct. This is the only move you have learned, but it is the only move you will need to know." The boy was still confused, but because he trusted his sensei, he continued training. After a few months, the sensei took the boy and entered him into his first tournament. The boy was as surprised as his competition that he won his first 2 matches with relative ease. The third match, however, was a little more difficult. But when his opponent made his final charge, the boy used his one move to dispatch him as well, and he moved on to the championship round. Now, this would prove to be his biggest test. The opponent for this match was bigger. He was stronger. He had much more experience. This was even obvious to the referee, who, out of a good conscience, was about to call the match off. But the boy's sensei insisted that the match should continue. The boy then proceeded to win the match and take home the first prize trophy. He was a champion. On the way home, the boy couldn't resist asking, "Sensei, how did I win with only one move?" The sensei answered him, "There are 2 reasons. Number 1, you mastered one of the most difficult throws in judo. And number 2, the best defense for that move is for your opponent to grab your left arm." Challenges very often veil opportunities. The fact that this little 10-year-old boy only had one arm was certainly a challenge. That's not a situation anyone would desire upon themselves. But under the instruction of a very knowledgeable and experienced master, this challenge was turned into an opportunity, and a very good one at that. I tell this story today because we are now faced with some challenges that are difficult to deal with. For quite some time, we've been dealing with the challenges of fear and uncertainty that come along with the current health threat that has, for quite some time now, been considered a full-blown pandemic. But as if that weren't enough, many of us are discovering that the simple instructions of staying home to save lives is perhaps more challenging than we ever thought it would be. A few people, thankfully it's only a few, have concluded that staying at their residence is just too much punishment to bear, and so they've decided to risk it and venture out. Now, if staying in their homes for a couple of days is too difficult for them to handle, I don't know what makes them think they can manage a whole year in prison. But I digress. The point is that this stay-at-home mandate has proven to be quite a challenge for many of us. The question today is whether this challenge may bring with it some opportunities. Perhaps your life has been so busy that you haven't been able to put much effort into maintaining the religious atmosphere in your home. At least not the way that you would like to. Maybe you didn't intend for things to get that way, but life happened, and they did. So now you're in a situation where you are, by law, required to stay in your home. And I can't help but see this as an opportunity to renew that focus on taking time out in your home to connect with the God of the universe, who created you and gave His life to save you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is the third Sabbath in a row that our Adventist churches here in Cayman have been closed. And as I've talked with different members during this time, I understand that many of us are hurting because we genuinely miss that experience of being able to gather together with the rest of the church and just experience that special bond and fellowship on a weekly basis. And while we are justified in longing for the time when we will all be able to meet again, it would be unfortunate for us to miss out on the opportunity that we have right now to focus on strengthening, or in some cases even reviving, an atmosphere of worship in our homes. Because the fact of the matter is that as valuable as church gatherings are, they can never be a substitute for home religion. Adventist Home, page 318 and 319 says, "In the home, the foundation is laid for the prosperity of the church. The influences that rule in the home life are carried into the church life. Therefore, church duties should first begin in the home. When we have good home religion, we will have excellent meeting religion. Hold the fort at home, consecrate your family to God, and then speak and act at home as a Christian." This is where I see a deeper application to the slogan, "Stay home, save lives." Because just as how lives can be saved by being physically present in our homes in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, I believe that being spiritually present in our homes is the key to saving spiritual lives. In John chapter 16, Jesus takes a moment just prior to His death to teach His disciples about what they can expect in the future. But the words He spoke to them could very well be spoken to us today because there are so many applicable parallels. Beginning in verse 32, Jesus says, "Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home." Jumping further down in verse 33, He says, "In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Right now, we are scattered about in our own homes, but at least we have no shortage of technologies that still allow us to stay connected. But what happens though if even technology would fail us? What then? At that point, the only one who can help you is Jesus. And Jesus says clearly, when it comes to tribulation in this world, it's not a question of if it's coming. It's only a matter of when. But the encouragement comes in that there's someone who has overcome the world, and that's Jesus. So if we too want to be overcomers, we would be wise to invite Him into our homes. Child Guidance, page 517 and 518 says, "If ever there was a time when every house should be a house of prayer, it is now. And yet, in this time of fearful peril, some who profess to be Christians have no family worship." The idea that prayer is not essential is one of Satan's most successful devices to ruin souls. Prayer is communion with God, the fountain of wisdom, the source of strength and peace and happiness. There's no question here. Prayer and worship are what it takes to fill our homes with an atmosphere of heaven and keep us connected to the one who can save us. So it is critical that we make prayer and worship a priority in our homes. But how do we go about doing that? Especially for those of us that have families with young children. There's so many different things competing for our children's attention these days. How do we get them interested in prayer and worship? I'm going to share with you what I think is the number one piece of advice on how to do that. Adventist Home, page 323 says, "Make the Christian life an attractive one." Parents are not to compel their children to have a form of religion, but they are to place eternal principles before them in an attractive light. Parents are to make the religion of Christ attractive by their cheerfulness, their Christian courtesy, and their tender, compassionate sympathy. In my experience so far, this has been the single most helpful piece of advice. Make it attractive. It's hard for children to show excitement for something if they think that it's boring. But if you can make it an enjoyable experience, you will surely reap the benefits. I can't tell you how good it feels as a father to hear Lillian, my 5-year-old daughter, come and ask me, "Papa, can we have worship?" Or Eliana, my 2-year-old daughter, ask, "Papa, can you tell me a story about David?" That's not to say that we have everything perfected. We're definitely still learning as parents. But it makes a huge difference when the children are engaged and actually looking forward to spending quality time together in prayer and worship. But I've come to realize that it isn't always easy. Sometimes it takes some sacrifice. As many of you know, our family only recently moved back home here to Cayman. In fact, in just a couple of days, it will be 6 months since we moved back home. Prior to that, we were living very far north in the country of Norway. And just over 2 years ago, we were still living in a city called Tromsø, where I was working as a pastor. Our girls were quite a bit smaller than they are now, but certainly just as sweet. I remember early one Sabbath morning, I was stressed out because time was running out, and I still hadn't finished my sermon preparation. Now, in my defense, preparing a sermon back then took a lot longer than it does now, primarily because I was writing in a foreign language. Norwegian is what it's called. I was stressed out because at the time, I didn't feel comfortable presenting in Norwegian with only partial notes. Believe me, it is not a good feeling getting stuck looking for the right words to express yourself in a foreign language in front of a church full of people. So it was important to me that I finish up as quickly as possible. As I was preparing though, Lillian, who was a 2, almost 3-year-old girl at the time, came over to me and asked me what I was doing. I said, "I'm preparing the sermon to preach at church." And I pointed to the book that I was using at the time on my desk. Then she said, "I want to help you." Now, you don't have to be a parent to know that, okay, yeah, after a certain age, yes, your child can help you, and that can be help that will speed things up. However, when children are that young, 2, 3 years old, help more often than not means that you're going to be slowing down. That morning turned out to be a pivotal moment for me in my growth as a father. Because as I was about to tell her, no, Papa is very, very busy right now, I felt impressed by God to reevaluate my response. I was reminded in that moment that just as important as ministering to my congregation on a Sabbath morning, perhaps even more important, is my call to minister to my family. I invited her to sit next to me at the desk. She took my book and pretended to read it, and then she started to preach in her own little way. I didn't finish my preparation completely that Sabbath. But you know what? I honestly don't remember how good or bad my Norwegian was in that particular sermon. What I do remember is that there was a 2, almost 3-year-old girl in my congregation that day who was paying keen attention to what I had to say. And when she couldn't even wait until we were in the car to tell her papa, "Good job," I knew I had made the right decision that day. I'm convinced now that now more than ever, we have to be willing to make sacrifices in order to get our children and young people more engaged in worship in our homes and ultimately our churches. Now, that may mean settling for things being a little less perfect than we would like them to be. But mistakes are part of the process of learning. And which of us never fell as we learned to walk? The thing about these kinds of sacrifices is that they cost us immediately. But what makes them worth it is the benefit they bring in the long run. After all, it was Jesus that said in Mark 10, verse 14, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of God." Being under lockdown right now, whether strict or relaxed, is a sacrifice for the majority of us. But our hope is that it will benefit our country in the long run. As we stay home to save lives, let's take some time out to consider the spiritual applications of this slogan. That to the extent that we stay our attention on spirituality in the home, we can save and even grow our spiritual lives. As we each tackle the unique challenges that are thrown at us in this crisis, let's remember to look out for the opportunities that come along with them. God's church will prevail through these trying times because our God is one who can turn a missing arm into an advantage. He specializes in taking our weaknesses and turning them into strengths. In these times of lockdown and quarantine, there can be many things that can be very good in and of themselves, but can consume us if we give them first place in our lives. Some people will give top priority to entertainment via Netflix or YouTube. Others may choose Facebook or Instagram in these times. But my hope is that you will choose today to stand along with Joshua in saying that, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Father in heaven, we thank you for ministering to us today from your word. Father, you see the hearts of all those making that decision right now to give you top priority in their lives. I pray that you will turn our weakness into strength and give us the resolve to put you first. May we see a revival of spirituality in our homes, even as we go through these difficult times. In Jesus' name, amen.